Welcome back. It's time to start talking about regulations. Now, unfortunately, here we do not have the federal materials in print. And so in this module, I'm going to show you the federal materials because I can access PDFs on the internet and show you what they look like and how they work. But I can't introduce you to how to find them in print because I don't have access. We'll primarily cover how to find federal regulations in the modules on Westlaw, Lexis, the other library databases, and in the free databases. As far as state regulations, we do have the actual regulations in print, but we don't have the other primary resource. So in this module, I'll show you those and introduce you to how to use the print regulations, but the actual how to find regulations will primarily be done in the other modules. So what is a regulation? We've already talked about that back in Module 1, but just as a refresher, a regulation is a set of rules or a rule issued by a government agency to implement a law passed by the legislature. So the regulations are the law that's created by the executive branch of government. And there are many kinds of penalties you can suffer for violating a regulation. So where does authority come from? Well, it comes from a couple places. First, it's important to remember that administrative agencies are not like a fourth branch of the government. They are actually part of the executive branch. If the President of the United States or the governor of a state are going to be able to fulfill their oath to see that the laws are faithfully executed, then they have to have the ability to create some rules that govern how they go about doing that. And that's one source of authority for the creation of regulations. The other is that the legislative branch, Congress or the state's legislature, has delegated authority to the agencies to create the regulations. And there's any number of reasons why they might do that. One being they're not experts. You don't have very many chemists or engineers in Congress. So they pass along the authority to an agency who can hire chemists and engineers and so forth to create those regulations. Also, congressmen and members of legislatures don't really want to spend their time doing that kind of hard work. They'd much rather be on social media or in TV or whatever else they do. So they give an agency the authority to do this hard work. Now, and a statute that gives an agency authority to do something is called enabling legislation or an enabling act. And it's important that the agency only do what it has been given the authority to do. A good example would be one fairly recently in 2023 in a case called Sackett versus EPA, where the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA had exceeded its authority by regulating wetlands and decided that wetlands are not quote unquote navigable waters, and it has to be navigable waters in order to be waters of the United States, which is what the EPA has the authority to regulate. So by looking at the enabling legislation, the attorneys for the plaintiff in that case were successful in arguing that the agency had exceeded its authority. And yes, I am from Maryland, so I say waters, not waters. Sorry about that. Now, we talked about due process back, I believe, in Module 1, so we aren't going to spend a lot of time on it here. I'm sure you remember that if you're charged with a crime, for example, you're entitled to due process, which addresses things like being told what the charges are and being able to see a judge and having an attorney and so forth. Those also apply if you're charged with violating a regulation. Now, there's another aspect of due process, and that has to do with the right of the people to know and participate in the rulemaking process. There's a federal statute called the Administrative Procedures Act, which addresses the requirements for making it known to the public that an agency is considering promulgating certain regulations and giving the public an opportunity to respond. And when we get to the free websites part of this class in that module, I'll show you websites where you can, at least you could until the most recent presidential election. I hope these websites are still there when we get to it. You could leave comments on proposed regulations. Well, the same thing's true in the states. Every state, I don't know this for certain because I haven't looked up every state, but I'm sure every state has an act. They may not call it the Administrative Procedure Act like California does, but they will have an act that governs the same thing. So, for example, a long time ago, I was what was called a governor's management intern for the governor of Virginia, and I worked with what was the Medicaid agency for the state, the Department of Medical Assistance Services, I think it was called. And one of the jobs I was given was to draft and then shepherd the promulgation of certain regulations on creating an administrative appeal process. And so we posted those in the state register, and I'm going to show you what the federal and the California versions of those are. And people were given the opportunity to comment, but of course way back then there was no internet, and so they had to send their comments in writing, and so I was the person that they would write to. So somewhere in the Virginia Register or whatever it's called is my name and my address at the time in Richmond for them to send me comments on these proposed regulations. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about you would find in these acts. Okay, finally we get to the actual names of some things here. In the federal system, there's a lot of administrative material, and if you really want to get into this, you need to take a class on administrative law and even a upper level legal research class on administrative law. But for the purposes of this introductory class, just these two sources that you need to be familiar with: the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, the Federal Register is where they publish regulations they plan to adopt. They publish announcements that they have adopted them. They announce meetings where the public can come speak. They also publish many of the daily activities of the president. The Code of Federal Regulations is once the regulations have been adopted, then they're codified, that is, again, organized kind of by subject, and they're published in the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, again, we don't have these, so I can't really cover how to use them in print, but I am going to spend at least 2 videos, I won't know for sure until I do it, but at least 2 videos showing you what they look like and how to read them and so forth and what's in them. But as to actually how to find federal regulations, we'll do that in later modules using online material. Now, along the same lines, California has these 2 that you need to know about. The California Regulatory Notice Register, which is a nice long title. And this would be where notices are published, like the ones in the Federal Register. We also have the California Code of Regulations, once the regulations have been adopted, and it's also referred to as Barclays. Now, I'll do at least 2 videos, one on each of these, and I will be able to spend a little more time on Barclays because we have that in print, but otherwise we will wait until we get to the modules on Westlaw, Lexis, and other websites to spend any real time about how to find regulations in them. So that's it for our introduction. The next video will be about the Federal Register.